This is a personal account of mine which dates back to the 1970s when I was about 19 or 20 years old. I was living in a house me and my roommates believed to be haunted, and it increased my paranormal interest. I was also actively working to make myself more sensitive to spirits, mainly through meditation. I had developed enough skill to sense and sometimes see or hear spirits. I was out somewhere when I saw an old high school friend of mine. We decided to go sit in a coffee shop and catch up the last couple of years. He spilled coffee down the front of his shirt and asked me to take him home so he could change. He wanted to show me some party clubs he knew later that evening. On the way, he told me a few of our other high school friends lived there too. They were all roommates. We arrived to an older home. It was huge, probably built in the late 1930s. He ran upstairs to change and told me to do a self-tour of the place. Nobody else was there. The living room was huge. 10-foot ceilings and a fireplace. The kitchen looked original but well kept and well preserved. I had to use the bathroom and I noticed the facility at the end of the long hall, so I made my way. Something moving caught my eye in one of the rooms and I turned to find something that stood about 8 feet tall. Fairly vivid and not happy I was there. I had short, stocky legs comparable to the rest of him, and his hands dragged to the ground. I could not see the face, as it was distorted. I did not tell anyone of my experience at the time. I felt that I should not mess with whatever it may be. A close psychic friend who we called Bird was invited to a party several months later. Yes, the party was at that house. The only thing I told her was to be careful. I called her a few days later to see how the party went. She told me she was choked while in the bathroom and had an incident which she refused to elaborate about. It was then when I told her of my own account, which made her quite upset when I didn't warn her about it. I talked to an old friend a couple years later after that. I knew her from high school and she dated the guy who occupied that room. I told her of my experience and those of my friends. She said she could hear knocking on the walls at night, which kept her up. Her boyfriend who lived in the room was an ex-football player who was built like a tank. He had a harmless teddy bear attitude until he moved into that house. Things went downhill until eventually becoming violent with everyone there. He was eventually told to leave and made an incident requiring police intervention. A few miles from where I live is a country park. It is a lovely place with a wide range of different trees, plants, and wildlife. People often picnic there, take children to play in the woodland playgrounds, or simply to explore. It has even been nicknamed Little Switzerland by locals because of the city's cliffs, which are dotted around the place. These cliffs mean that the park is on a multitude of different levels. Some are accessible via slopes and steps, but some are not. It is on one of those inaccessible cliff tops where we were witness to something that we could not explain. Almost 2 years ago, my girlfriend and I decided to go on a trip to a country park. We had been at university all morning and wanted to be outdoors for the remainder of the day. It was an unplanned trip, but we hoped to walk around the woods and have a late dinner at the country inn. We must have been walking around the park for about an hour or so, exploring the woods, identifying birds, and enjoying our surroundings. We had reached a quarry situated in the middle of the park. It had flooded a considerable amount of the area, and so we walked further around than we may have. I had previously visited the country park a number of times and remembered seeing what looked like the remains of a huge old house on one of the largest cliff tops. I knew my girlfriend would find this as interesting as I did, so I made an extra effort to find it. We eventually reached a gravel pathway at the foot of the highest cliff. There was no way up without climbing equipment, but it winded around the cliff's perimeter, thus enabling us a perfect view of the above remains. We must have only walked in the path for 10 minutes, if that, and I saw what I had been looking for. The remains included an old brick wall on the very edge of the cliff top and what looked like brick archways with wrought iron bars and no windows. It does not really resemble a house anymore, but I have reason to believe it was at least part of the grounds, which I will explain later. I walked a few feet ahead of my girlfriend so I can point up to where those remains were, as they were pretty well hidden amidst the trees. I turned to look at my girlfriend for a split second before looking back to where I was pointing, and it was in that moment that I saw it. Exactly in line with where I was pointing was something I could only explain as a creature. It was on a natural edge created in the cliffside, just below the remains we had searched for. The ledge was overgrown with ivy, and the odd tree was here and there. It was very green up there, and this made what I saw contrast with its surroundings quite considerably. It was a creamy peach color, and it looked like the shape of a head, but it had no redeeming features. Although describing this remains, it reminded me of how scared I was looking at it. It is the way it moved which made my blood run cold. It seemed to be lying down, peering over the edge of the ledge I described. It must have been looking at me because when I turned my head back to where I was pointing, it moved backwards into the overgrowth. It didn't even move like a human. It sulked back effortlessly. Like I said earlier, it was impossible to get up there without climbing equipment, and if anyone was up there, you would see them, despite the overgrowth, and the ledge was not that big. Also, if a person was hiding and peering over their edge, their facial features would have been more than visible. This did not have any, or at least it appeared not to. Not to mention that most people would probably have moved in a clumsy manner and would have still been visible. Whatever was up there was not fazed by me seeing it. It moved with confidence, and with a slow movement, it was faded away into the ivy. It looked like it may have been slightly bigger than a human being, another reason why many facial features should have been visible from that distance. It was not a silhouette of anything, not that I would have described as a ghost or entity. I could see it as clear as day, but it was not human or like any animal I've seen. Needless to say, I immediately asked my girlfriend if she had seen what I had, but she did not. I described what I had seen, and we both fled the woods as fast as we could. We had to carry on walking the same gravel path that was enclosed between the cliff and the slope. This left me startled and intrigued. I had been to the country park a number of times before and never encountered anything like that. I decided to do a spot of research, and I found some articles about an old house called the Cliff in the country park. There was only ever one person living there, and they were explained as having a split personality, both a woman and a man. They are rumored to have spent their time drawing pictures and hanging them on the gate to their property for passerbys to see. Another house was also explained, which sounds very much like the remains I described, even the location. An old gate to a huge garden is supposedly hidden in the ivy on that very cliff top. It is said to lead an old period house, which was once an orphanage. This is kind of old, but I've never come to a satisfactory conclusion on what it was, and I'd like some help in figuring it out and making sure it can never come back to me again. I was fairly young, maybe 11 when it first came, and it terrified me. I had until then always slept easily, but insomnia laid its course upon me at the time in my life, and it came with it. I would wake suddenly, shivering under my blankets no matter how warm the room was, and it would be there looking down at me. It was always in the same corner of the room, no matter where I put the bed, and always somehow crouched up in the corner where the ceiling met the walls. It was a scrawny, long-limbed thing, humanoid in shape, but with arms and legs far too thin, that ended in long, bony finger-like appendages with clawed tips on both sets of limbs. It had no identifying changes in color, and a round, featureless head, but I could always feel like it was looking at me. However, it did so. My sleep got worse, but it didn't increase the frequency of my seeing it, maybe once a week or so. I wasn't fond of horror movies or books, nor did it come on specific nights that I might be able to say, man, I gotta lay off the tacos, they give me weird nightmares. And I wasn't asleep. I know the difference in feeling between the almost awake but dreaming state and the awake state. Then I began to feel it stalking me in the daytime. Somehow. It was never visible then, but I felt it whenever I went up or down the staircase to my room, causing me to rush in either direction to keep it away. It never came at night when someone was there with me for a sleepover, nor did it stalk me in the day if I had a friend over to go up the stairs with me. In fact, most of my pets didn't react in the room, but they made no effort to go up to it either. And the pet fish I would occasionally have go belly up relatively fast. I didn't overfeed them or starve them and kept their water nice and fresh. The thing, as I came to think of it, continued to come for about 2 years, sometimes with longer breaks in its appearances, until my grandfather died when I was about 13. 6 months after that, I woke up seeing the thing cowering back in its corner as best it could, with a large, vaguely luminous figure holding a baseball-shaped bat in its hand standing next to my bed. My grandfather had been talented at baseball until he took shrapnel in the arm during World War II, and I remain convinced to this day that he put the thing in its place about me. A week later, my dad was bringing my brother home from school and looked up to see my grandfather sitting on the porch. And my mom, who believes more in things that are not of this particular plane than my dad, went through the house with its ceremoniously blessed sage and a cleansing prayer, and after the thing never showed up ever again. As I've said, the thing hasn't been back since then, but lately I feel nervous and would like to know what it might have been, and if there are any ways to make sure its spinally form doesn't take up residence in my life once again. So any help would be great. The other night I was hanging out with my friend. Let's call her H. My friends and I usually always get together on the weekends to socialize and travel the city. It is a normal thing for us. After our week in school, we get to relax and have some fun with each other. Normally it is a group of about 4 or 5 people, but every once in a while someone can't hang out because they have to do something else. But this weekend no one could hang out except for H and I. I was alright with that. It was just a little weird because H and I haven't hung out much alone together. Anyway, we met up around about 6 p.m. We walked around for a little bit until it was pretty dark. We went to her room and ate dinner, and we didn't really have anything to do. We decided to just sit in her room and talk, so we did. We sat on our bed and listened to music for a very long time, not doing anything. We just were enjoying the music. We got to talking about a lot of things, such as vibes, religion, evil spirits, and different energy types. I like to talk about these things for some reason. They're just so intriguing to me. Whenever I find someone else who likes to talk about these things, it kind of makes me pretty excited. I also consider myself to be a very spiritually sensitive person. I've always thought that I can see a little bit more than what is actually there. This is just what I have come to believe as I got older, and I've been raised to believe that I will be able to see spirits and communicate with them. As this night went on, we were getting pretty tired, anxious, and just plain bored. She was texting her boyfriend, and he was acting kind of weird, and it was causing her to become a little distraught. I didn't think much of it because I usually don't pay attention to other people's relationships problems, and I guess I thought it just wasn't a big deal. He then proceeded to tell us that he took a bunch of mushrooms, and then he gets lost when he does them, which kind of confused and frightened us a bit. We were trying to apply tons of different meanings to what he meant when he said he just gets lost. It weirded us out a bit, but it still wasn't a big deal to us. We were just so surprised that he was alone. Because both of us had done mushrooms in the past and we knew what they could do to a person, especially if that person is alone. Being alone on them is just a big no-no. I'm sure some of you may know this. Some people may prefer to be alone, but not the majority. So after he texted us that he gets lost whenever he does mushrooms, he didn't answer after H called him over and over again. She went on Facebook and messaged him and texted him again and again, because yes, we were a bit nervous that he took a bunch of mushrooms while he was alone, especially since now he isn't answering anyone. There was a part of me that just wanted to shrug this off and just think his phone died and fell asleep or something along the lines of that. But for some reason I had this bad feeling like something bad was happening to him. I kept getting mental imagery of bad things happening to him, and so did my friend H. We shared that we both had a bad feeling about the situation to each other, so I convinced her that we'd go check on him. It was kind of a wild and crazy idea at first, since he has roommates, and if we just knocked on the door at about 12 at night, it might be a little weird. Plus, he lived on the other side of town than we did. He lived in a pretty bad area of town, an area known for its crime rates and drug use. But we made our decision. We were going to check on him. So we drove about 15-ish minutes until we got to his house, and we parked in front of his house. It was a pretty huge house from the early 1900s or something. That's how most of the houses in that area were. Big and old. We just stared at the house, contemplating if we should get out. We still couldn't really believe we drove all this way there without his consent in the middle of the night. So yes, we were a little nervous to go up to the door and knock. We looked at all the windows in the house, and only one of them had the light on in the room, and it was his room. So H was just staring at his window very hard. I didn't get why she was looking so hard at the window. At this point, neither of us were afraid. We were just fine. She told me it looks like he was in the window staring at us, and so I looked. I saw a weird pattern on his window. I knew it wasn't a person. At first I didn't really know what it was, but there was a film of a water-like substance over his window. It looked like it was glowing or reflective. I was just in awe. I asked her what she thought it was, and she said she didn't know, but it was moving, like it was alive. It was shaking, morphing, and bubbling. It was kind of gross looking. It began to scare us a lot when we began to realize we were witnessing something paranormal. We thought that it could have been a manifestation of negative energy going to her boyfriend in his room, and we were just watching it flow in. It was the strangest thing. It's as if the stuff was reacting to stimulus. Like there was a force moving and controlling it. I don't really know how to explain it. At this point, we were afraid. We didn't know if we should go into the house if there was a negative energy in it. We were both beginning to get short of words because of how afraid we were. Then at the corner of my eye, I noticed a red flashing light. I stopped moving instantly and stared at it. It was in between two houses where it was very dark. There was probably about 50 feet between the houses. It's as if it were trying to get my attention. And it did. It surprised me at first because it was very noticeable. H noticed that I was staring at something and decided to look where I was looking. We were both describing what we were seeing out loud, and it was matching up. We were both seeing the same thing. Let me explain to you what we saw. Right under the red light, there was a childlike figure. It was the size of a child, except it was extremely skinny. It seemed it was kind of shiny, just like what we've seen on the window, yet extremely dark, darker than what we know is dark. It was something, though. She described that it looked like it was playing while I thought that it was eating. Whatever it was, we were watching it. I remember the feeling of complete terror that came over me. I immediately knew what we were looking at, and so did she. I remember how my heart just dropped into my stomach. I felt an intense anxiety inside of me while I was watching this. It was so frightening. I wish I could explain in words how much fear was pumping through my veins at that moment. There was no explanation to what it was. It was no type of animal, and it most certainly was not a human. It gave off a feeling of pure evil and filth. It was moving as if it knew what it was doing, like it was intelligent. The last thing that made this so weird was where we saw it. It was in the complete darkness. Why would something be in the darkness right there? What would it be doing? It seemed as if it was also giving off its own light a little. It looked vivacious. It seemed extremely angry or extremely hyper. I then told H to turn on the car and that we need to go now in a very serious tone before it knows that we were there. She scrambled for her keys, turned on her car, and we sped off as fast as we could. I did not take my eyes off the thing. I was just waiting for it to change or disappear. But it didn't. As we drove away, I even saw it from different angles. It didn't ever acknowledge that we were there, though. Thank God. We were both silent and pale as we drove away from the house. We didn't say a word. We were frozen with our fear. She drove back a few blocks to a McDonald's and parked in the parking lot and looked at me. She said, "We need to talk about what we just saw." We were both shaken up and just speechless. We tried to comprehend what just happened, but it's like we just couldn't. We didn't even want to believe what we saw. I remember just sitting there. I could still see that thing in my mind. It was real. It wasn't a movie. It wasn't a game. What we had just seen was in real life. The more I thought about it, the more terrified I got. She explained to me what we had needed to go back, because her boyfriend is on mushrooms and is vulnerable. With that thing near him, it all began to make sense. That thing was probably there for her boyfriend. When you do mushrooms, your mind opens up a lot. It can make your mind extremely vulnerable to the spirit world, especially to people who don't know what they are doing. The thought of being alone with that thing frightened me so badly, and that's just what her boyfriend was doing. I decided that I would wait at McDonald's while she went back and tried to get in the house. As I was getting out of the car, I just decided I had to go. I couldn't make her do that alone. I needed to face this situation. This was a complete test of my faith. I was so scared, I didn't want to go back with all my heart. But we couldn't leave him there, so we decided to go back. I took off my cross necklace and held it in my hand, squeezing it. We decided to walk to his house since it was fairly close to where we were. The neighborhood was so dead, it was so dark. All the houses were huge and falling apart. Some of them, the paint was peeling off. It just wasn't a pretty sight. As we were getting closer to his house, the negative feelings were building up more and more. My heart was just racing. I had my hood on and my head down because I didn't want to see anything. When we got next to the house, we felt this cold breeze. It was not a windy night, but a huge whoosh of wind just slammed into us. It just gave us the feeling like we were not wanted in this area. We were right in front of the house and we were slowly walking towards the door when we heard a very loud screaming noise. It sounded like an infant crying. It was just screaming and yelling, and the sounds seemed to surround us. It was a terrible noise. It sounded human, yet not human at all. It sounded like the loud cry of an infant mixed with a screaming cat. It was an unpleasant noise. It did not sound of this world. H ran back to me and we started to quickly run away. We stopped, then realized we shouldn't let this thing scare us away, so we walked back and knocked on the door. No one answered, so we left. We got back to her car and we drove back to his house instead of walking. One last time. We parked in front of his house and we looked for the thing that we seen before. And yes, it was still there. Except this time it was still. It was just standing there. It looked kind of like it was searching for something on the ground slowly. It looked discouraged, though. It's weird how it stayed in the same place to me. Right before we were going to leave, H got a text from her boyfriend asking if we could come over. How weird is that? We were already there. We were at his house for about an hour trying to find a way in, for almost no reason, just because we had a bad feeling about the situation. So he was fine. He calmed down. He was returning to reality, but he said he went through hell. He was almost in tears because of how scared he was. H ended up taking me home that night. I was so happy to be in safety of my own home. A few days later, H and I met up because we needed to talk about everything that happened that night. We needed to just clarify everything, and we did. She then told me one thing that really freaked me out. She said that her boyfriend almost killed himself that night. That he was so far gone that he almost killed himself to escape the terror. I was just shocked at that. Because to me, that explained why that thing didn't want us near the house. I was bewildered. That night taught me not to be afraid in certain situations. Even if you are terrified out of your mind, you shouldn't back down from anything that you feel needs to be done. I still cannot really believe this all happened. There were a ton of coincidences, like the fact that no one could hang out that night except for her and I. It's like we were meant to go through with all that. Let me promise you this is 100% true. This happened last weekend to me. I feel like I have finally regained enough courage to actually think about this so that I can post it on here and share it with others. Thanks.